Okay, welcome and thank you for joining us for our session on how to write a research proposal, a guided uh, demonstration. Okay, before we start our session, let me speak few words about our initiative, which is CUSP initiative. We are a non-profit initiative of researchers from South Asia, based at different universities like Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, JNU, DU, among others, dedicated to making research and learning in social sciences and humanities more accessible, especially for learners in non-metro regions or undeserved institutions, underserved institutions. Now that we look back on how far we have come since the launch of this year, we realize that at first our work began with a simple observation, or you can say a question, that some of the most foundational skills in the humanities and social sciences, like how to read or text closely, think methodologically, or ask hard questions, are often sidelined in our pedagogy. Many of us have felt this gap at first hand. Cuspids are small but deliberate response to this. It's a space for pause, for returning to the fundamentals not as a remedial step, but as a way of honoring the labor of thought, a reminder that scholarship can still be slow, generous, meaningful, and serious. We have hosted free informative and training sessions, sometimes multiple in a month, covering everything from the basics of research to writing a proposal to doing literature review in learning referencing. We have also hosted writing workshops and even special sessions co-hosted with seminar forums in Oxford and other institutions and universities. To reach more learners, we have started offering sessions in regional languages because language should never be a barrier to learning. And there is much more to come, and your input shapes it. If you think of session topic or a collaboration, do let us know. We all do our best to make it happen. If you have found CUS helpful, we would be grateful if you could share it with other students or researchers who might benefit, or do subscribe to our mailing and follow us on social media for updates. Your encouragement goes a long way in fueling the work we do. So thank you so much for joining us. Before we start the session, let me introduce the panelists. We have two panelists, Sana. She is a PhD candidate at the Department of History, Oxford University, and Monika, a PhD candidate at the Department of Criminology, Cambridge University. Now I'll hand over the platform to Sana and Monika.
All right. Thank you so much, Prabhakar Bhaiya, for introducing Kashf and both of us. Um, are you able to hear me? Am I audible to everybody?
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Uh,
Thank you, Ashutosh.
Monika, you are audible.
All right. Thank you, Bhaiya. So I'll begin with the question that what is a research proposal, right? So what is the document supposed to do? What is the research proposal comprised of, and what role does it play? So, a research proposal, as many of you might know, outlines what you plan to research, right? So, why it is significant and how you will conduct it. So, it's a kind of a pitch that you make to whoever is reading about your proposal. A proposal is a pitch, right? So, why do you want to do a particular thing, and how will you do it, and why it needs to be done, right? So, that's exactly what the research proposal also is about. And the purpose, as I just mentioned, is to convince the readers, including advisors, committee, funders, that your research is worth undertaking and that you have some idea about or more often than not a clear plan about how to execute it. The plan, of course, changes over a period of time, but at the stage of proposal making, you have to have a clear plan as to the fact that how you will execute it, because that is also one way of showing that this plan is executable, right? And we'll come to the feasibility part in a while. um, So there are some key components of a research proposal, right? So there's a title, introduction and background, statement of problem, literature review, research question, objectives, methodology, and references. And we'll discuss all of these components today in the session. Also, you have to remember that not all research proposals have to have all these eight components. So, for instance, sometimes people mention a statement of problem in the introduction and background itself, and they do not have a separate section for statement of problem. Similarly, research objectives might not come separately after research questions in every proposal, and you might have kind of clearly specified your research objective in the introduction itself, right? So there's no hard and fast rule to have all these headings, but this is a good guide to understand what needs to go in the research proposal, right? Um, Now, when you're thinking of a research proposal, first you need to think of a researchable topic, right? So, what is a researchable topic, researchable area, or what is a research problem that you will be looking at, right? So, how do you come up, how do you arrive at a researchable problem? There are various ways in which it can happen, right? So it can happen through an observation that you might have made, something that you have come across, you have read, a claim that somebody else made and you were thinking about it, or you think that it does not completely align with how you have thought about that particular subject, a hunch about something. It could be a personal experience as well, or an experience of somebody around you, or it could be a policy issue, right? To just give some examples, for instance, this is one report that came out that in India, 74% cannot afford a healthy diet. And this was a UN report on, diet and food and etc. And this report could, lead to several research questions about contestations around measuring food insecurity in India itself, right? So, how do we understand food insecurity? What are the parameters on which food insecurity is measured? What are the standard global parameters, and do we want to contest it, or what are, how do we understand how global parameters are set, and what are the politics behind that, right? So all of these become important questions for research, but also important areas through which you can come up with several other research questions. But this becomes a problem, right? So this becomes a problem, that how is food insecurity measured? It's a problem, a statement of problem, right? Now, to give another example, it could also come from experience. So for instance, this particular research came out of the experience of the researcher's mother's experiences, of being a tea plantation worker. But you have to understand that having an experience, an observation, or just coming across something, or just having a hunch about something, can expose you to probable areas of research, or the problems that are capable of, might have the potential to be researched on. But it might not be sufficient, right? So you also will have to then read the literature on it, and then see what kind of literature exists and what is the exact gap that you want to then address on that. And we'll come to this in, we'll discuss this in more details in due course. So, for instance, in this particular thing, so it is said that my mother's experience inspired me to do research on tea plantation worker, but then it's not sufficient, right? So then you say that no significant amount of academic literature exists on so and so topic, at least in context of Wayanad, or so you specify one particular context where it has not happened, and we'll discuss all of this, like how do you specify your research, how do you narrow it down, right, and how do you delimit your research, right? So experience reports, existing reports could be few starting points to think about a research problem, right? Now the question of how, right? How do I write a research proposal? And there's this thing that generally we do have some sense about what we want to study, and also how, why we want to study it. But generally we do not know, we struggle with understanding that how I want to study it, right? And if you think that you have an idea about how you want to study it, then there might be something, you might want to think more about it, because more often than not, the how question can only be answered once you have a more clearer sense of what you want to do, right? um, so one of the things about how to study is to narrow down your broad area or broad idea of research, right? So ask yourself a few questions. So for instance, what aspect of the problem interests you the most? What aspect of the problem is most relevant according to you? And how much of it is feasible, right? Feasibility is also very important, because PhD is like a 3 year or 4 year research, and you have to do a research which can be completed in 3 or 4 years. And also you have to do a research where accessibility, and certain existing methodological paradigms can be employed to gain answers to your questions. So those things have to be kept in mind, and we'll again discuss in more details when we come to research questions. Then also fixing boundaries, as I was just mentioning, right? So time, place, people, where do you want to conduct this research? What time period do you want to look at? Now, all research do not have to have all these boundaries, but you might have to have some boundary, right? So for instance, if I'm doing a research on the legal position, let's say the Supreme Court's position on certain topic, let's say on the question of right to dignity, or right to life. So I'll have to fix a time period between which I want to see, or I might want to see understand like Delhi High Court's position on so and so, right? So for instance, so those are the ways in which you delimit your research, and we'll give you more examples as we go forward. Of course, seek guidance as to if this is what. So, for instance, when you're talking to your peers, your so teachers, faculty, ask them that this is what interests me. This is what I have been reading on. What do you think could be, probable areas of research that might emerge from this, right? And then, of course, it should be something that aligns with your interest and passion, because remember that PhD is a long journey, and more often than not, it's also a lonely journey. So you have to take up a subject that you can stay with for 3 to 4 years, sometimes 5 years, 6 years, right? So make sure that what you're agreeing to sign up for is something that will keep you going for 4 5 years, and you can commit to it for 4 5 years, right? Um now the question is that how do so we were discussing that how do you arrive at a research problem, right? So one is that you have to narrow it down, and there are ways in which you narrow it down, which we just discussed. Now there are certain ways in which you arrive at the research problem, and there are certain things that you need to keep in mind in order to do it well, right? So you have to understand the broader area of research, right? So you have to start broad. So for instance, if I want to understand, let's say, if I want to understand the harms involved in intimate partner violence, then I'll have to read on gender-based violence in general. I'll have to read on the sociological, literature on intimacy in general, and then kind of, come up with specific research questions. So we'll always have to start broad and also read broad. So you have to understand what kind of literature exists in that area. So you have to get a mapping sense of that area, right? Unfortunately, there's no escape from reading. You have to always read widely, broadly, and it's only after a particular point that you can start reading in a more focused manner. But it takes time to reach there, and before you reach there, you'll have to read very widely, right? Um, engage in the classroom, engage in the discussions that are happening in the classroom, seminars, engage with whatever you are reading. Don't just read to kind of say that okay, this scholar says so and so. So don't just read to summarize, and don't just read in a descriptive sense. Read to engage with the thinking of the author, right? So this is how the author is thinking, and are there other ways of thinking? Are there other ways of approaching this issue, right? So read in an engaged manner, engage with your peers, engage in seminars, other scholars, and familiarize yourself with the research, the practice. Familiarize yourself, right? So there are three components to when we do a research, right? So there's a research component to it, there's a practitioner component to it, and then there would be a pilot that you can do to kind of familiarize yourself. So researching would be just reading the existing academic literature on it, understanding how scholars are thinking about that issue. Practitioner would be to also kind of understand that if there's a practitioner's view of the issue, and also researching itself as a practice, right? So you can start doing research as a practice in your day-to-day life. So for instance, whenever you come across something, there's a way in which you research almost everything around you, right? So for instance, if you have to make a travel plan to a different country, then you research about that country, right? So it's both. So there are two ways in which you can be a practitioner. You can take a practitioner's approach, right, to arriving to a research problem, which is that you do research as a practice, but also you see what are the practitioners' approach to it. So, for instance, if I'm thinking of doing a research within law, then there would be a different way in which the lawyer approaches the question. There will be a different way in which the civil society organization members have approached a particular social problem, right? And then there's pilot, of course. If you have some broad idea about what you want to do, then you can always do a pilot study to be able to be able to understand whether this is a doable research, whether this is a feasible research, right? Um, Now, there are three questions that you need to keep in mind, and this is kind of an reiteration that what do you plan to accomplish through this research? What do you want to? Why do you want to do it? Why is this research important? And how are you going to do it? Right. So, what methodology are you going to use to be able to execute? The broader research plan that you have. Um, just going to the step-by-step writing guide, and we'll discuss the entire structure of the research proposal, including the introduction, literature review, and the references and everything. But just some broad tips about how to go about writing your research proposal. So choose your topic, and in choosing your topic, pick a topic that you are passionate about, right? um, Now, passionate about is one thing, but once you're passionate about something, do you also think that this can be realistically completed in the time frame? And the resources that are available to you is something that you have to think about, right? So we might want to do, okay, this is a very interesting topic. I can do archival study, kind of have a longitudinal view of it, right? So a historical view of something, as well as I want to understand that what people what are the kinds of meanings that people associate with it in present time. So I want to do some ethnographic study, but can you do ethnographic study and archival study both on that particular subject is something that you'll have to think about, right? So then you'll have to make a pick, in all probability, that what is it that you want to focus on more, or is there a way in which you can do both and yet be able to finish it in the timeline, right? Now ensure that the topic is specific, manageable, as we just said, feasible, right? So it has to be, the topic cannot be very broad. It has to be specific, and there are ways in which you narrow it down, and it has to be manageable. So it can't be talking about 10 different things at once, and you can't be thinking of analyzing 10 different factors and variables at once. So there have to be limited variables and limited subjects that you want to study. Draft a working title. So I think this is very important that you create a title which is very concise and it's also informative, right? So you should not focus on it being very flamboyant and very flowery. It has to be very direct, very specific, and it tells whoever reads the title should understand what the research is about, right? So, for instance, one title example is The Impact of Urbanization on Local Biodiversity, a study of Indian metropolitan cities, right? So, right from the title, it is clear that it's a study on urbanization, it is a study on local biodiversity. So, it will kind of, it will straddle the literature around urban studies but also environmental studies, so you already get some sense of what the research could be about. Write the introduction and background. So the first thing that you do is that try to have a title, write the introduction and background, that whatever context in which you want to study this, and whatever concepts that you might want to clarify. I'll just come to introduction in a while. See, the introduction is something that briefly gives the context of the study, right, and its importance. But in giving the context of the study, of course you situate the study in the broader research problem that you have, and you also situate the study contextually in the social cultural context or in a particular jurisdiction if you're doing a legal research. But also what you do is that you clarify the concepts that emerge in your title, right? So for instance, if it is a study on understanding of whatever researching urbanization, or impact of urbanization on local biodiversity, then you need to also spell out that what do you mean by urbanization, right? And we'll come to it in a brief while, to discuss it in detail. The statement of problem, as we just discussed, it briefly describes the larger context of the situation surrounding the problem. It provides background information to help the reader understand why this issue is important. It introduces the area or field in which the problem exists, as I just mentioned, so urban studies, environmental studies, and it focuses on the facts and data, avoiding vague or overly broad statements. So you have to make sure that when you're writing the statement of the problem, so your introduction could be broad, right? So you can broadly map the field in the introduction a little bit, but then the statement of problem has to be specific, that this is what the problem is and this is what I'm going to inquire, right? um then there would be literature review, and we'll discuss all of this in detail, right, in a while. Literature review, you know that you have to first conduct a preliminary literature review, and it's not really a literature review, but a literature overview of sorts, right? So you try to map the field of study that you think your research question would lie in. You summarize key studies that are relevant to your topic, but you don't just summarize it, you also kind of synthesize it, right? So you synthesize it so that you arrive at certain research questions. So you synthesize it with the broader research problem that you have, to be able to arrive at a research question, right? So it's a critical engagement with the existing literature. It and then in the literature review, by doing this, you have to also highlight the gaps that your research will address, right? So and so work has happened, and this is what this research is going to do. Also define your research question. The research question, just like the statement of problem, um, needs to be clearly stated. Right now, you there are two ways of doing it. So when we are writing the research question, you state the problem before that. That this is the problem at which I'm looking at this. I'm seeking to inquire, and this is the research question that I'll be addressing. Right, and we'll be coming to this in a while again in detail. State the research objectives also clearly, right? So you can list your aims in bullet points, or you can have a clear, concise statement of research objective. People do it differently. Sometimes they write it after the research questions, that this is the objective. Sometimes they write it in the as a part of the introduction, right? But that's a choice that you can make. Then you have to have a research methodology, a broader research methodology. So if these are the questions that you want to inquire, how are you going to do it, right? How will you inquire those questions? Now, remember that these are research. What I'm talking about right now is research methodology and not just research methods. So it's not enough to say that, okay, if I have to understand the impact of urbanization on local biodiversity, I'll go and talk to local population, so I'll interview them. It's not enough to say that, because that just covers the methods that you'll be using for data collection, right? But there's a larger theoretical framework and approach that you will be taking to that research, which forms a part of your methodology. So what is the broader theoretical paradigm, right, that your research is informed by, is something that you will have to specify. What are the key concepts that you wish to work with, or any variables that you have selected for this study? Methods of data collection, that could be interviews, surveys, fieldwork. Tools or techniques, so would you be doing a statistical analysis of that, or would you be doing discourse analysis of that? So what is the tools and techniques going to be? Sample size and selection criteria, again we'll discuss more in detail, but you need to specify as to what is the sample that you're looking at, what is the size of that, and also like who are the, like, how have you chosen that sample, right? Like whether it is random sampling or what kind of sampling it is, and we'll discuss the kinds of sampling in a bit again. Break down your research process into phases and estimate the time required for each phase. Especially, this is important when institutions require you to provide a timeline, right? Like, how will you do the research? So, it's helpful to kind of break down your research process, that this is the time that I'll allocate to literature review, this is the time I'll allocate to designing my research methodology, etc. This is the time that I'll allocate on the field work, and then this is the time that I'll analyze my data, and this is the time when I'll write my analysis, right? So that breakdown is helpful. Also, remember that PhD is very long, right? And there's no structure to doing a PhD research, so it's always helpful to make your own structure, to always make your own kind of uh, target posts that you have to kind of achieve. It's helpful then to keep a consistent flow in doing research, and there are no there will always be, but then to kind of minimize periods of extreme slumber and then extreme activity, it will always be, but then you can minimize it if you do some of this, artificial structuring from your own end. Then justify the methodology chosen for the research. So you will first spell out the methodology, but then you'll also have to justify it as to why is this methodology helpful for conducting this research, right? A number of times when we are identifying a gap, the gap could also be methodological. And if you have questions about that, we can discuss it further. But remember that in that case, then the methodological justification becomes like a probably a an entire large part of your literature review as well, right? Um, Anyhow, and then you'll have a working bibliography, of course. At the outset, you might not know exactly what your research is going to entail. Even if you know your research questions, you might not know eventually what findings you will come up with, right? Unless you have conducted the empirical data, or if you're doing textual analysis or just, data, document analysis or something, then also you will have to kind of that bibliography might change depending on what emerges from your findings, right? But then in the beginning you'll have a working bibliography which will have a list of all the sources that you have cited, as well as the ones that you just mentioned or allude to. You can also add the sources that you may study at some point during the course of research. If you have some idea about that this might become important in my research, then just include those as well. Of course, use a consistent citation style. Sometimes institutions have a prescription about what citation style they want you to use, in which case, stick to that one. But in any case, if you pick up any citation style, it is fine, but then make sure that it is uniform, right? So, consistency is important. Now, general tips for writing a strong research proposal. Just reiteration, be clear and concise, avoid jargon and long winded sentences, right? Um, One thing to remember is that when you're writing a research proposal, it will go to a more often than not, it will go to a varied set of audience, right? So if you're applying to even an Indian university, on your panel, in the interview panel, there will be people with very wide set of expertise, and there might not be people who have direct expertise on your subject, or there might just be one person in your interview panel who will have direct expertise on your subject, right? So it always helps to write in simple language, and to write, one way of writing in simple language is of course to avoid jargons, avoid unnecessarily complex phrases and words, terms, but also write small sentences. When you write small sentences, the readability of your text increases. So do that. Focus on the significance. Emphasize the importance of your research in filling a gap, right? So because when you're making a research proposal, as I just mentioned in the beginning, you're making a pitch, right? That this is an important work to do. Now, one way academically, how do you do that? Academically, you show that this is the gap, right? So this is the academic work that has happened, and this is the gap. And by doing this research, this gap can be filled in so and so manner. And this and then also, like, this gap will be filled, so how will it help it, right? So that also becomes important to justify. The rationale of the research is as much about filling an academic gap as about explaining as to what will happen when you fill that academic gap, right? Use subheadings. Make your proposal easy to navigate by organizing it into sections, and we gave you a template of the sections that you can have in the beginning. Seek feedback, share your draft with peers, mentors for constructive criticism. It helps a lot. Sometimes you wouldn't even imagine that this could be one way in which you could have thought about this question, but it comes up in response from your peers and from teachers, etc. You can always do this also, like, not just when you have made your research proposal full-fledgedly, but even when you have your research ideas, we were discussing in the beginning, just keep discussing with peers and teachers, and it might just open up horizons that you might not be aware of at the time when you were thinking about that problem. So talk more, discuss more, write more. It always helps. Now, okay, so this is what I was talking about, that when you identify the gap could be of various sorts, right? So the lack of research can be in various ways. There could be a lack of research in the sense that there could be a time gap, there could be a geographical gap, or there could be a population gap. So, for instance, time gap, as I was just explaining. But to give you another example, and this is an example that I generally use because this is a question that I also have in my mind, which is, so for instance, feminist movement in India is very well documented during the time the Justice Verma Committee report came, right? So around 2013-14, when the Nirbhaya incident happened. So around that time, and also previous to prior to that, the feminist movement in India is very well documented. What happened to feminist movement in India, and what are the debates and questions that are emerging in the feminist movement in India post 2013 is something that is not that much researched on. So that could be one kind of time gap that you look at, right? So your research could be about understanding feminist debates and questions, or understanding feminism in India post 2013, right? So something like that. Geographical gap could be that, okay, this research has happened over here, but not much research exists in context of India, for instance, right? In law, it is very common to do this kind of to identify this kind of geographical gap, because it's very easy to identify jurisdictional gap, right? So in this jurisdiction, people are talking about, for instance, rape by deception, etc., but in this jurisdiction not much discussion is happening around it, right? So those are the geographical gaps. So you see that in this particular region this work has not happened, and then why is that work important in that particular region is also something that you'll have to explain. Then population gap, again, it's similar. A particular area, people from a particular area that you want to research on, or a particular tribe that you want to research on. So that could be the what kind of sample you want to work with. That could be the population gap, right? Um, the other way of identifying gap is having is developing your research in response to existing research, right? So for instance, there are conflicting, so there are two ways. One could be that you can say that there are conflicting findings in the various research that you see in a particular field, and then you try to explain those conflicting findings, or you try to come up with a finding in response to those conflicting findings. So that is one way. The other way could be that your own research idea conflicts with existing study, right? So you can say that if I take so and so approach, then that does not align with what the existing findings have been. So you want to interrogate that further. That is the other way of doing it, right? The third way is also, you say that there are certain problems that have been been raised in the previous studies, but then you kind of highlight the inadequacies of those studies, right? So for instance, you can say that, so a lot has been said about how the government has spent more on the advertisement of certain schemes in India. So some kind of literature exists on that. This is hypothetical, okay? I'm not sure if literature exists on that, and if it doesn't, please do go ahead and research on that. But you can say that there's some kind of literature that exists on that. But then, what enables state, right? So what makes it possible for the state to continue to spend so much on advertising the schemes while not implementing it is something that has not been studied, right? So you see, you're already drawing on the existing literature, but you are saying that that study is inadequate on this particular front, and this is the particular front that I'll be studying, right? So these are the ways in which you identify and state your the research gaps. Okay, so if you have selected the right kind of problem, if you have raised the right kind of questions, on the big part of the undertaking is done. However, remember that research is a process, and research will constantly evolve, right? Throughout your research journey, even after your research proposal is approved and you have kind of started working, your research will kind of keep evolving. It will keep probably also changing. Sometimes it might not change that much, but it might also change. So it's a process. It's also a dialectical process, which is inwardly and outwardly directed, in the sense that you're also constantly contemplating and thinking about the adequacies of your own research, and you're also constantly talking to others, and then thinking, you're interacting with the field that you will go to do your research on, in case it is a fieldwork driven research, or you're interacting with the text. So it's a kind of I think it's called hermeneutical circle, where basically you have certain four conceptions with which you do research. You have some, you have some idea with which you start your research, but then it constantly evolves in interaction with the new findings, with new ideas, externally or through your own reading, that will come up. So it's a process, and you have to be patient in the process. Now, about the research proposal, we begin talking about the structure and how to write the research proposal now. Remember that the act of writing research proposal is a process of narrowing down, as we just discussed, and collecting the scattered thoughts, right? Now, one way of collecting scattered thoughts and writing, narrowing down, is to start writing. So just start writing to be able to make better sense of what is it that you are thinking and how you are thinking about a particular issue, right? I'll come to the structure now. So I'll begin with the introduction, and a little bit more, but then hand over to Sana for discussing literature review, methodology, and references. So the introduction I discussed in the beginning only. So I'll just reiterate over here briefly that it has to give you it has to give the audience an overview, a background, the context of the study. It has to clarify the concepts. So we were just discussing that how, if it is about impact of urbanization on local biodiversity, you have to specify what does urbanization mean, right? um, etc., etc., and how research fits into the research priorities of that particular subject area. So what are the kind of studies that exist in urban studies, for instance, on interaction between development and biodiversity, or development and nature, etc., environment, right? So what are the debates that exist in that field, and how does your research, kind of fit? Where is it placed? Where is it situated in the priorities of that subject area, is something that you'll have to mention. Now, note that introduction is not to build suspense. So, one way of writing, this is a narrative way of writing that many people follow, where in the introduction, what they do is that they build up. They use it as a build up. If everybody understands Hindi, it's called bhumika banna, right? So introduction is not about just building up. There's some amount of build up that you do, to be fair. There's some amount of build up that you have to do, but that build up has to also be very concrete in terms of, the context in which you are studying. Just giving an overview that, okay, this is the context in which I'm studying, this is the broader debates that are happening, which makes this inquiry important. That is that statement, and that, broader overview is what the introduction is about. It's not about just narrating that, okay, so this happened and this happened and this happened. No, so you don't have to do that build up, right? People will lose interest. So introduction has to be crisp. um, Statement of problem. I think we have already discussed this, so I'll kind of skip this for now. But just to kind of tell it quickly, I think if you have a separate section on statement of problem, it just needs to be more detailed, right? So you can present the rationale of your proposed study, clearly indicate why should anybody be bothered about the research that you want to do. So the rationale, basically a detailed description of the rationale, and also the boundaries of your research, right? So, like, this is the field in which I'm going to intervene, and this is the front on which I want to intervene, is something that you have to specify clearly, either in the statement of problem, if you have a separate statement of problem. If you don't have a separate statement of problem, you can do these things in the introduction and background section also. Okay. Now, arriving at a research question. So far, we have discussed about how to come up with a research idea, a broader research problem, right? A statement of problem. But how do you come at a research question? Now, after you have read the literature, after you have thought about the issue a little bit, there would be many questions that will come to your mind, right? Now you have to kind of locate the questions that are coming to your mind within the broader research problem that you had in the beginning, right? So, for instance, if my broader research problem is that how does the state gain legitimacy to do certain things, then only certain questions that would arise from my question about advertisement and schemes would become pertinent, right? So, for instance, my questions about foreign direct investments in certain sectors where the scheme is also operating would not be important to this broader research problem that I have. that I have identified, right? So place it within the scope of the larger research question, and then separate major questions from minor questions. See, whenever you're writing a research proposal, you cannot have more than two central questions, right? So you'll have generally we have like one central question, but you can also have two central questions if you think it is important. So one or two central questions, and then there will be sub questions, right? So we'll give you examples in a while. So for instance, this is one research objective, and I'll read it out. The proposed study on women informal workers is aimed at unpacking the gender dimensions of informality along with other social and economic dimensions. The study also aims at discerning the multiple dimensions of living and working in NCR by looking at the work informality vis-a-vis the shelter informality of the women informal workers. A key focus of the study is to understand the impact of the pandemic on the livelihoods of women workers and their households, right? So now, if this is the research objective for somebody, many research questions can arise from here, right? So, what is the migration? Because it's talking about shelter informality, right? As and how is that linked to work informality? So, what is the migration history of the worker, the trajectory and means of entry to informal work? What are the conditions of work, nature of contracts, regulatory protection, and what are the determining factors? How do social factors such as caste, religion, region contribute to these formations, community formations? What is the nature of the informality attached to settlement patterns? So these are many kinds of questions that can come up. Remember that you cannot perhaps pursue all of them. So you'll have to identify a central thrust for your research, and then have questions that kind of help you answer that central question, right? So this is broadly it about introduction and research questions. I'll hand over to Sana to talk about literature review and further on from there. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, Monica. Thank you so much. That's a lot of speaking that you had to do, but thank you so much. And since a lot of speaking has been done, let's also hear from others. I think at this point. So before I go on to discuss about literature review, I just wanted to quickly get a show of hands. How many of you have seen a research proposal before this, before coming to this session? Have you ever had a look at the document called research proposal? Can I have a quick show of hands, or can you just like tab in the chat box? Right. I see. Okay. I see two show of hands. One like, yeah. So am I? Okay. Right. And are you? Okay. Great. So I'm assuming you also, since you are in the session, you are at some point planning to write one proposal, or you're working towards writing a research proposal. And no, if not, you already are in some situation where you're supposed to do research. Okay, but that's great since I see lots of fan coming up. So I do assume that you've kind of had a look at a research proposal. Great. Because I think I'll be showing a proposal here quickly after this, and I'll need you to be with me while we do that. Okay. So before I move on to talking about my proposal, here we can just quickly go and discuss um, literature review. So when I say literature review in an initial proposal, it is not really a literature review that you're doing. It's not possible at a very basic stage to completely do a comprehensive literature review. So what we actually end up doing is a literature overview. Now there's a difference between literature review and a literature overview. um but anyways, for the sake of the diction of the proposal, let's call it literature review. Why are we doing it? What do we do when we are doing a literature review? Why is it important? So it's to put it in two words, it's a mapping process, right? We're constructing a map of the existing body of scholarship or literature which exists on a particular issue that we want to study or are interested with, right? So the idea is to give a reader an overarching glance or glimpse into the existing debates on the particular subject, right? Okay. So if I am studying something, I would want to also tell the reader very it's a very commonsensical thing, right? Before I, for instance, if I'm talking to Monica about a particular thing, I first need to give her the context. I first need to tell her who said what on this, right? And then give her my standing And this is a very commonsensical thing because this is something we almost do all the time in different conversations in our lives, right? When there's a news to share, for instance, I can't just tell Monica without giving her the context or who said what in this broader thing about a particular issue, and then get to my point, right? Otherwise, she won't understand. That's a very basic, rough, rugged example to put for you to understand why is this important. So, what are we going to do when we are doing a literature review? We are mapping this existing scholarship, right? There could be empirical studies, there could be theoretical work, whatever it is, and whatever speaks to the kind of issues that we are going to work on, we have to rope all of them in. We could look at what has been done so far in the field, what is important or what can be extracted within this larger body of scholarship for my own research, what in this larger body of debates is relevant to my own research or aligns with my own research, what are the most important texts related to research, and how do I engage with these texts. So the issue is to engage, right, not just to list. So imagine, this is a very, I mean, I've used this example so many times now, but it's, I think, very helpful because that's how I arrived at understanding the difference between summary and synthesis. And when we are doing a review, we are synthesizing. So what's the difference? Difference is, imagine a room full of people, and you have been assigned a job. So when you enter the room, there are many people in the room already, and they're talking among themselves. Let's imagine, okay, they're talking, baat kar, and they're discussing about things among themselves. And what do? How do you enter that conversation? You cannot enter that conversation between the people already in the room by simply listing out who is speaking what. That's not what you're doing, right? You can't simply see, okay, XYZ person is talking about XYZ issues or ABC issues. That is summarizing. That's not what we are doing here. We have to make sense of the conversation. What is A saying in relation to B? Where is C intervening in that debate? And if A, B, C are speaking on a particular topic, what are they really saying? How is that conversation being built up? And where do I enter in that conversation, right? So it's crisscross, it's a network, it's a web where I'm going to place my work, where I'm going to make sense in ways to make sense of this conversation. So how do you make sense of that room full of conversations? Imagine literature review like a conversation field, a field of conversation where you have to enter. So listing who is saying what in this conversation is not going to help me. You have to tell me how are they going to talk to each other, what issues are they discussing, what is the to and fro, back and forth, what is the debate about, right? So that is what literature review really does for you. It really helps to make sense of the broader conversations in any room that you enter. The room here essentially is a research field. Can we move to the next slide, Monica? Okay, but how do I find the literature? Fine, okay, this is the way I'm going to do literature review, but where do I begin? How do I find the literature? It's easier, thankfully, these days, thanks to democratization of internet, so to say. One way is citations. So, for instance, if there is a canonical text I've picked up on a particular issue. So, for instance, if I'm looking at liberalism, I'm studying something around liberalism. My favorite example, the very canonical text to go to is J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, on liberty, right? Or people who have commented on John Stuart Mill. So there are secondary commentaries, and then I go to the end part of the book, and there are citations. They have cited. There's a bibliography, working bibliography. The scholar has cited certain people in the field. I look at the bibliography. I look at the titles, and from the titles, I can make sense of what is important in this bibliography for my own work, and then I snowball. Right? I follow the bibliography. I go one article, second article, third article, their bibliography. So it's a chain which kind of is builds, and I have to follow. So that's one way of doing it, and that's why bibliography is so important. It gives you a glimpse into what this person has read and what might be important for my own work. That I take the article ABC, then I read ABC. ABC also will have some bibliography reference, and then I keep following. I know it can get a bit taxing, but when do I know that I have at least some broad idea? It's when the works start repeating. So you can see that, okay, people are now quoting. It's a circuitous loop of citations that gets formed, and you can feel, okay, I read this person's mentioning that. It's a point of saturation. So you'll know. Another example that I usually give is when do we know it's enough is, for instance, if you've entered in a new address, you've moved to a new place, right? And it's a fairly new landscape for you to make sense of where's the grocery shop, where's the provision store, where's the mall, where do I get my milk from, where do I get my bread from, right? And the more you live there, the more you start identifying the streets, you'll know exactly where is that shop, where is that corner, where do I get my things from. The moment you feel the same thing happening within your research field, right? It's a sense of familiarity that develops over time. Know that you're almost there, know that you have read enough to kind of start thinking further about the topic. But this will really come in when you start working on this research proposal during your PhD, not in the initial days. It's very difficult while writing a proposal to kind of map the whole field. A good way to do it is Google Scholar. Kashf has done, I think, a session on how to find literature, so you can always go to the YouTube and look at it. But Google Scholar we recommend because it's a very handy tool to take you to the relevant literature, and we'll show you in a bit how that's done. Okay, and of course, seek guidance. Ask your teachers to begin with that. What are the canonical or important fundamental texts that I can refer to with this topic? And I'm sure they'll find some way to pointing out the relevant literature to get you started. This is what Google Scholar looks like. It's a very important interface. If you've not already checked, please type in Google Scholar. This is the page where you land. So as you can see, a good way to know the existing landscape of scholarship is, so if you look at the, what is this? This is the left side, right? Anytime can each, if you look at there's since 2023, 2022, 2019. So it actually tells you by what date, right? It sets a limit on the timeline, and you can get any article you want on a particular issue based on this timeline. So you can sort by relevance. I have clicked sort by date, but there are other options here, and include citations, etc. So if I want to know about land ownership in India, if there's a topic which is related to land ownership in India, then I type in the dialog box in the search bar, land ownership in India, and it effectively gives me almost every literature which is there, which has some internet footprint. And I have a list in front of me, and then I start going from one article to the other article. You can also see the first article, social inequality in land ownership in India, study with particular reference to West Bengal. So I assume that this is about West Bengal, but look at the citation number, cited by 73 people, which means this is an article which has been circulating for a while. It is important. And similarly, you can gauge the citation numbers and see how important it is to the field. You can also look at the title and make some sense that how important it could be. Then you simply go to it and it'll find some way. It'll open maybe a PDF on JSTOR or other search engines and databases. Can we move to the next slide, please, Monika? Okay, since 2019, since it has been selected 2019, so the articles here will cut down at 2019. Since 2019, after 2019, therefore, you can always customize this range. So this is just to show you that how you can play with the date, timeline, relevance, etc. Can we go to the next? Okay. Again, include citations. So this will include citations. That is the option which has been selected. If you look at the any type here, the any type section, it shows an option called review articles. Now this is interesting, and this is very helpful because review articles are basically articles which synthesize and bring together a map of the existing scholarship on a particular issue, which means they have reviewed the field already for you, and it will give you a broad brush of the existing debates in a particular field. So these are all. Monika, do we have a next slide? Can you just go back to the slide? Thank you. So what now we have in front of us in the screen is our articles which review the scholarship. They are called review articles. So does land ownership make a difference? Women's role in agriculture, Kerala, India. So it will almost have all the scholarship debates, important papers signposted for me and discussed in detail on land ownership and women's role in agriculture in Kerala. Similarly, gender discrimination in land ownership will have all the scholarship relevant to gender question when it comes to land ownership, in relation to land ownership, right? So because it has been narrowed down to women, hence the articles around women's relation or gender question in relation to land ownership. Okay. Try not to miss the major ones, which are important. As I said, major articles, major books, canonical texts, for which your professors should be helpful in pointing you out to. Semi-freeze reading, please take note. Semi-freeze in the sense you don't have to completely read everything, but please make your notes, know what is in different readings when you're building the database for yourself. Do not read to procrastinate reading. Now what happens usually is हम लोग कहते थे कि okay, I'm still reading. Did you write anything? Did you make a proposal? I'm still reading. I'm in the process of reading. That reading never stops, and it's not going to stop. So you need to semi-freeze the reading. You need to decide this is the point. Okay, I'm gonna read for 1 week on this particular issue. I'm gonna read 5 articles every day, and after that, I will start writing with whatever basic idea you have. You can always improve a written draft, right? But don't delay writing. And this is a suggestion I also give for my PhD work, right, to people. Don't procrastinate writing. Set a benchmark for yourself, set a time limit for yourself. Okay, 1 week, 2 week, I'm going to read. After that, I'll write. Given whatever I've read, doesn't matter. I will begin somewhere with whatever I've read. Okay. Methodology. Now, this is important. Can we move to the next slide? Now, these are a few methodology. How do you basically design your research? There's exploratory way of doing it, descriptive, explanatory, qualitative, and quantitative. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of all of this because we are continuously doing sessions on it. So you can always go and check the sessions that we do on these bits. But these are just some pointers and signposting that we usually use the terms, right, in our methodology. So by what is a methodology section supposed to do? This is I think one of the most misunderstood sections so far. Most students confuse methodology with methods. Most students just use, I will use qualitative methods. I will use mixed methods. This almost tells us nothing. It only takes us so far. We need to know how are you basically going to conduct your research. Okay, so what methodology answers is, what evidence do you have in this field that you're going to build on your work? Why this evidence? So you have to provide a justification, why this evidence, or why this work, why this approach, why this method, why this tools of data collection, why not other kinds which might be possible, why is this the best way, and how will I analyze it, right? How will I go about it? What is the approach I will take? There are different ways of doing it. Principal research strategies, you do it through experiments. You can carry out surveys. There's field research. You can use and build on available existing data. Those are some ways to do it. But before we really move to discussing methodology and research, it's very important that you fix your unit of analysis. What is it that you are planning to describe or analyze, right? Is it individual people? Am I studying a thinker here? Are we looking at social roles here, right? Are we looking at, say, for instance, a field of gender relations, positions, households, relationships? Are we looking at families, organizations, cities? Are we studying a particular book, a document, maybe even sites, buildings, or a particular locale, right? So it's very important that you fix the unit of analysis. So for instance, there was a topic that just came up when we were discussing the title, the impact of urbanization on local biodiversity, a study of Indian metro cities. Local biodiversity, right, is the broader unit within which I fix Indian metropolitan cities. So, but that's a space, right? That's a site, Indian metropolitan cities I'm looking to look at, but what in there? Local biodiversity. So I've fixed my unit of analysis as local biodiversity. Similarly, you should always be clear on what is your unit of analysis, because that will determine the direction that your research takes. Can we move to the next? Thank you. There might be ways that sampling might come up. You'll need to sample at some point, right? So for instance, you might want to know how many such units of what particular description should be chosen by what method. Sampling frame, all cases from which sample is selected. So what is your sampling frame? But a question of sampling comes mostly when it'll not come if you're doing a book, for instance, if you're reading or studying or analyzing a particular thinker or their work. But it'll most likely come in if you are dealing with a particular group or a population or a community. Then there are different ways to sample. There's probability sampling, non-prob sampling. You can combine. But these are very technical terms, and perhaps they will need a particular session that we specifically dedicate to sampling, and we are doing that. So if you're interested in getting your doubts clarified about sampling, we will for sure do some sessions on that as well. But sampling is something which is a part of your methodology, and you should be mindful about that. Other ways to do is interviews, structured, unstructured, semi-structured, group interviews, focus groups, ethnographic, narrative interviews. So these are different types of interviews. You have to pick your best. And ethics, of course, always be informed. These are ethic. I mean, I always had a outline, a smaller section of on ethics in my proposal. Not every work requires a section on ethics, but it's always good to have one, and especially if you're dealing with human being as your unit of analysis, right? And there is the question of informed consent, confidentiality, anonymity in your interviews. If you think that the people with whom you're researching are in a particularly vulnerable position, then consent, confidentiality, anonymity, rapport, especially in ethnography work, really is important, and you should think about these aspects as well. Can we move to the next slide? Referencing. Okay. Monica, we'll go to the next one. Yeah. So you will have a working bibliography towards the end of your research proposal, but this is, when I say working bibliography, it's different from referencing. References is all the works that you have cited in your proposal, but a working bibliography is which I prefer for my research proposal, which also includes tentative work that I might look at in the future. Please, you can either have references, but also working bibliography is fine, and I usually prefer working bibliography. And to ease your work, please learn this tool. This really is a free tool which helps you understand, which basically sorts your citations and referencing. You just simply have to feed the style, what style of referencing you're doing. And if you learn this tool, then your referencing is sorted for life. You don't have to manually do it. Please, in this age of AI and technology, I would say make use of it. I'm not going to tell you completely shun manual referencing, but please use it in combination. It saves you a lot of time. We have already done a session on how to do Zotero. We use Zotero, so we do recommend Zotero. But there are other tools available as well, and you can search and see what's best for you. But this is how Zotero works. So it gives a dialog box where you can just type in the author and the data. Basically, the references automatically generated, as you can see in the footnotes, right? It has all the different options, footnotes, endnotes, etc. And there are other sessions, Zotero, how to use Zotero. There are other sessions on it as well on YouTube. So please do take some time and have a look at it. Um, if English is the barrier, doesn't matter. There are different free sessions for you to learn to pick this up. We're also doing regional language sessions, so if there's a concerns, you can always drop in. Do use AI tools to kind of bring this all together. Keep your proposal as simple as possible as you can. See, we don't have to complicate life. We don't have to complicate things. Make it as simple as you can. Don't leave the reader in suspense. We are not writing a suspense thriller here. Do not use jargons for the sake of it unless they carry some conceptual weight, unless they are technical bits to your technically relevant to your proposal, or they have a conceptual weight. Avoid using jargons. Sophisticated language, jargons is not equal to great proposal. In fact, lucidity, clarity is what you should go after. And Monica, can we just move to the next slide, if that's okay. So these are the references that we had used this in our proposal. But before we go to the questions, Monica, can you just quickly end the stop screen sharing, because I want to share my screen here. Thank you. Okay. Can you all see this? Monica, is the screen visible?
Yes. Yes, Sana, it's visible.
Yeah, it starts with vast amount, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
A
perfect.
vast amount of literature. Yeah.
Lovely. Can I quickly ask the students, participants who've already looked at a proposal, what do you think is a section? What do you think this is doing? It's a section in a proposal that I had submitted back in my age to a center in JNU, CSLG, Center for Law and Governance. But what do you think this section is about? You can always drop in the chat box for me to see. Sanjana's written, okay, Kalyani thinks it's a literature review. Sanjana thinks it's methodology, statement of purpose, methodology, literature review. Interesting. Now I'm also confused. The people who've written literature review, what do you think makes this a literature review? You can always unmute and talk to me. It's fine. And we don't have to be correct or just don't think about those things. We're students and we have an equal relationship here. Um, but if people can tell me, why do you think this is a literature review section? Research problem gap. Okay. Would anybody want to tell me, whoever has written literature review, tell me why do you think this is a literature review? Or even a statement of purpose? Engaging things in literature. Introduction. Wow. It's doing everything. You can just unmute and talk. It's fine. Monica, what do you think? What do you think the section is? It's the end part of the literature review. Interesting. End part of the literature review. Okay.
It sounds like research objective, but I'm not sure.
I mean, it definitely talks about the object of the research. Does it give the does it give you the idea that what this research is about? Can anybody guess what this research question could be about, or what this research proposal is about? It'd be great if you can unmute and talk. That's the whole point of it. Otherwise, it's just us doing a monologue. Methodology. Kajal, do you want to talk? Please go ahead.
Yeah. So I think you're comparing judgments. Uh, yeah. I couldn't scan through quickly enough, but I basically think you're using different judgments and comparing them to each other.
Yeah, so it's basically something to do with the judiciary comparing judgments, right? So if you look at the first highlight in this section, it uses lens of legal hermeneutics to offer thick description of judicial readings and verdicts of the judiciary under the rule of UP and NDA to test phenomena of democratic backsliding in India. That easily gives away that this topic is basically about democratic backsliding, but it's using the entry point of judicial rulings to talk about democratic backsliding by evaluating and comparing the judgments passed during UPA and NDA on a particular issue. The particular issue is not very clear in this bit, but it's on religious minorities, and this is essentially it's basically a note on methodology, right? So, but I begin with first, I'm just going to quickly say, okay, take a large amount of literature exists, but this is what I'm trying to do, and how I'm going to try to do this. I use the lens of legal hermeneutics. I am going to offer a thick description of judicial readings and verdicts, right? I'm going to look at UP and NDA's regime. I'm using it's a comparative design, comparative framework. I also kind of outlined in my method the time frame from 2004 to present moment. So I've delimited the work, but this can effectively also stand in introduction, not a problem. But then I also, in my methodology, outline the multiple layers that I'm going to look at. And one of the things that I take as a pivot is doctrine of essential practices. So I declare it's the doctrine of essential practices. And I also look at readings of secularism by judiciary. I also kind of pull literature into it, right? Now, this is because many times you will not have enough word limit to separately talk about literature. Then you have to kind of club the existing literature with some section in your work. I did it with methodology here. Then I list out 3 parameters that I'm going to study, the issues that I've selected for study. Why am I going to look at, say, anti-conversion, interfaith marriage, place of worship, national anthem, etc. And I also kind of then say, okay, I will use discourse analysis to carry out this interpretive exercise, right? So this is how a research proposal looks like. If I take you from the introduction, give me a bit. Okay. So this is the title. And introduction, quickly, basically I don't really make it a thriller. I very quickly outline that, we've been hearing a lot about democratic backsliding in this country, but how well founded is this claim? There are different ways to scrutinize this claim, but one way is to evaluate state of religious minority under present regime, and to delve into multiple ways in which the issues and contentions are treated by the government. And I compare NDA with BUPA, and that is exactly what my introduction is. But see how little, or the space, the percentage, the portion, it's quick, right? So it's not even a page, it's just maybe half a page, or more than 3/4 of it. And then I go to the statement of problem, and statement of problem is where I kind of expand on the issue. So I comparatively first globally look at what is happening elsewhere. So democratic deconsolidation or backsliding, Poland, Turkey, Hungary, and then I kind of come to the issues which are pertinent to our part of the world. And then I say, okay, fine, but how do we understand democratic backsliding? So I organize it around 3 axes. But then I say the focus of my study is on the second axis, which is accountability. And judiciary has a role in maintaining or in sustaining accountability for legislature and executive. And then I get into judiciary, the debates on constitution, secularism. So I develop a constitutional context basically for situating my research, right? And then to see how consistent the judiciary has been in its readings, rulings, verdicts concerning religious minority. Is there a break or is there a continuity? So I kind of compare. And then after but while doing this, I also rope in a bit of literature. So I rope in literature at 2 places: in methodology, and in, so you can see Khetan, etc. have been cited, and a bit in statement of problem. So it really depends on you. You can have entirely separate section on it, up to you, depending on the word limit. And then finally a research question. So I have a central research question, and then these are smaller parts of this larger central research question, right? So I want to look at relationship between democratic deconsolidation and shifts in judicial standing on issues pertaining to religious minority. And then these are parts of it. So I have almost 4 sub questions, but there's only one central question. And then I follow it with a note on methodology. And then there's a tentative bibliography. When I write tentative, it's a working bibliography. So all the works cited here have been mentioned as a bibliography, but also the works which tentatively I would at some point refer to have also been mentioned. So this is how a research proposal is supposed to look like. And there are different ways of doing it. We now open the floor to question answers. Thank you for staying with us and for listening to our monologue. But it's always good if you guys can, ask questions and interact, so that it feels like we're talking to a live audience. Prabhakar, please take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica and Sana, for this wonderful and insightful presentation. Now, floor is open. Please ask your questions. If some of you are not comfortable in asking directly, you can write it down in the chat box. And feel free to ask any question. It should not be just be related to this session. If you have any allied question vis-a-vis research or anything, or readings or any text, feel free to question us. If we can't answer you, let me promise we'll come back to you for sure.
Hello.
Hi, please.
Hello, can you hear me clearly, sir?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the session. It has been very useful first. Then I have some questions. First, could you please shed some light on the use of AI, when it comes to research in universities abroad, Even I'm confused about the extent to which it can be used. Yeah, first question. Second one, what could be the length of a proposal? It should be in 2,000 words or 5,000 words. So, and third question would be that what could be the minimum number of academic research papers or books, which we are supposed to mention or read when it comes to the research proposal, a solid proposal, the number of reference. So thank you very much. It has been very useful. Thank you.
Okay, before Sana and Monica answer this question, can you introduce yourself briefly? Just tell us your name and where are you from?
Sorry, I should
And
have
either
done it
city,
earlier.
nothing else.
Sorry. Yeah. So my name is Gunasinghe Raja. So I'm from Sri Lanka. So I'm from Jaffna. I work as a temporary staff member at the University of Peradeniya. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Sana and
Monica, do you want to answer this?
I'm just delighted to hear from somebody from University of Peradeniya. I've heard so much about it, besides the fact that it's a very beautiful place. About the use of AI, length and research papers, number of research papers. About the length, first of all, so it varies, right? So the wherever you are applying, the institution you are applying to would specify how many words they want you to write the research proposal on. Um, I don't know if there's any place which does not specify. In case it is not specified, maybe 2000 words, 2000, 2500, because that's like kind of the middle range. Generally, limit exists between 1000 to 3000 words. So 2000 is like a good yes to go with. Use of AI, again, I think like every institution has some kind of guideline, not every, but like some institutions have come up with some kind of guidelines about how to use AI. One thing that is definitely prohibited is the use of AI in generating ideas, right? So you cannot use AI in generating ideas, but some institutions and certain journals allow use of AI for formatting and also language improvement. But then also kind of check with the institution wherever you are sending the research proposal, because it might vary. The third thing to remember is that whenever you're using AI, it is one ethical thing to do is to declare the usage of AI, right? So you declare that you have used AI for so and so reasons. And generally when it is only for editorial, like minor language improvement or formatting issues, for instance getting reference, like not getting references, but if you have the references and you just wanted to put it in one format, so those usages are considered fine, but it varies. So again, I would reiterate that check with the institution. Research papers minimum level, I think, when Akanksha, I'm saying, sorry, when Sana was talking about, saturation level. So that is the way in which you kind of, understand that this is where I can stop, right? So there's no fixed limit to reading. When you think that ideas are getting repeated, that's where you can stop. For research proposal, generally, if I have to still give an answer, I would say that around 40 to 60 references are considered good. There's again no straight jacket formula for it. It's Imagine if you have to write 1,000 word proposal, right? Then 60 references does not look good, because then your references would be like 10 pages and your proposal would be like 3 pages, right? So it really depends on how elaborate the proposal discussion is expected to be from the institution. For a normal journal article, we generally say 60 references is considered like good, but then also that's very vague. That's like very arbitrary, I would say, not vague. So you have to take a call, and in taking that call, I think it's helpful to see that when is it that ideas start getting repeated? When is it that when you're snowballing, if there are certain references which are coming again and again, have you cited those references which are repeating? So once you have those references which are getting repeated and cited again and again in the when you're doing the snowballing, once you have them in your references, I think it's all right. Like you're good to go, I would say. But Sana, if you want to add.
No, I think I agree. With the AI, the policies change with regard to every institution, but avoid AI. Um, at least in the first draft, you can always use it for like generative AI. I think certain universities allow generative AI, which help you edit, etc. But yeah, I think I agree with everything that Monica said. The length of proposal 2000 is a good safe range to go with. You can, if it's like more than that, you can always increase. There's not a problem. If it's less than that, you can always cut down. But 2000 is a good word limit to yeah begin with. So I think, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
I'll just say a few things vis-a-vis the length of the proposal. I think when we were writing proposal for the MPhil, what we have asked is a statement of purpose, which is not more than 500 to 700 words, right? So when it came to the PhD, it was close to not more than 3,000 or 3,500 words. 2,000 or 2,500 was a good length. But when I'm writing it for now for postdoctoral fellowship outside, they really look for a very in-depth research proposal, which might go around 5,000 to 6,000 words, in-depth literature review and the objectives. And also you need to explain the methodology and the site. So that might go up to 6,000 to 6,700. That also depends what you're applying for. So these are just some. I'm so sorry. Oh, okay. I want to just add that. Nothing else. Any more questions? We have few questions in the chat box, but before we go to the chat box, let's ask if they can ask directly here.
Hi, this is Bhagyashree.
I think Bhagyashree. Hi, Bhagyashree. Please.
Hi, so I am a PhD student at Presidency University, Kolkata, but I also want to try to apply to a few more places. So I want to learn how to write a research proposal, and I was thinking, Monica spoke about theoretical framework and conceptual framework in the methodology part. If you would like to guide us more about how do you come up with the concepts or theories that would be relevant to your research, and where do you place it actually? Would it be good to place it within the methodology breakup itself or a separate section dedicated to theoretical framework? Yeah, that's my question.
Thanks, Bhagyashree, for the question. I don't think, just to answer your last question first, I don't think for the at the level of proposal you need to have a separate section on theoretical framework. Also, you don't need to have a detailed explanation, not explanation you'll have, not a detailed, description of what that theoretical framework is. It is enough to allude to the theoretical framework so that it is clear that your understanding of methodology is not just about the methods of data collection, but you have accounted for this fact that you know that you'll eventually also be doing data analysis, which will also be a different method, right? So I think it's just that it's just making the at the level of proposal I'm speaking of. Obviously, when you write the thesis, there might be a separate chapter on theoretical framework. Sometimes people write theory and methods together in one chapter, so it would depend. But at the level of proposal, in the methodology section, if you can just allude to that, what is the lens through which your research is informed by, right? So, for instance, if I'm choosing to do an ethnographic work of a sexual violence redress ecosystem, my research might already be informed by some kind of feminist theory and feminist analysis, right? So you'll have to specify that this broader ethnographic work is, informed by so and so theory. Similarly, if somebody is doing work in informal labor, it could be informed by Marxist approach, or still just feminist approach. So it depends on your research questions that what your theoretical framework would be. And a little bit of allusion to that in the methodology is important also as a part of explaining your positionality, right? So it's just that just making it transparent that this is the approach, this is the lens through which I'm approaching this question. But Sana, do you want to add something also? Just before Sana speaks, one thing to remember is that whenever we are using a method, sometimes it is already embedded in certain philosophical or theoretical paradigms, right? So for instance, if I say that I'll do critical discourse analysis, then it is already embedded in post-structuralist thought. We cannot say that we'll do critical discourse analysis and then use a theory which is completely foundational and believes in what is it called, metaphysical explanations, basically. So those things have to be kept in mind, that it needs to be consistent, and sometimes certain methods are emerging from existing theories. So
Yeah, I think I'll just, that's the exact point I had to add. I just wanted to flag what usually students end up doing is sometimes हम लोग कहते हैं we want to use this XYZ, three frameworks, three theoretical lenses together. Like I want to read, for instance, I want to read a particular author through Foucauldian lens, through that lens, then to arrive at a Marxist analysis also. That's not possible. Um, be careful that when you use different theories, the premises of every theory or theoretical approach has to be compatible with the other approach. If there are conflict in the premises, in the basic premises, because basic premises of each tradition, theoretical tradition, will define the direction it goes in. Now, if there is incompatibility or tension between basic premises, then they're going in the opposite direction. It'll be a very difficult thing for you to neatly then come out of it with something which is acceptable, or without contradiction. So if you're doing that, it's not a problem if you're doing that, but there should be some caveat or some justification why or how you're going to resolve that tension. What is that one premise that you're going to disregard or leave or discount for to make it compatible? So just take care of that. For instance, the proposal that I just showed, which is what I did, I used the overarching lens of legal hermeneutics to go an approach, but within legal hermeneutics also there are different theories that I could be later on using. At this point, I did not find it enough or adequate enough to signpost that, just did the overarching theoretical approach. But if there's a specific theory then within that tradition, you're free to signpost that and give a justification depending on where you're coming from, really, with in relation to that field or topic. So yeah, for instance, if you'll see, for there's a lot of work on labor politics, etc. As Monica said, Marxist lens is very commonly used. Subaltern lens is also very freely used if they are doing bottom-up histories, or they're trying to understand marginalized or excluded voices. Feminist also is completely compatible within that tradition. So yeah, I mean, if that helps, that's what I
Thank
do.
you. That was really helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think Kajol has a question. Kajol, please ask.
Hello, my name is Kajol. I'm from Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bangalore, and I'm breaking my head over my research proposal. So the question I have is, how do you separate like major questions and minor questions? Because what I'm coming up with is, if I make a major question, the feedback I get it, this is too broad and it's too exploratory. And if I'm coming up with something specific, which is like a what question, that is too simple and it can just be finished in like a paper that I can do already. It doesn't have to be part of my PhD proposal. So I'm getting these kind of feedback, which makes me wonder like what makes a good question. And from your proposal, Sana, I basically realized that I can have like sub questions to a main question that can maybe solve that. But I want to know how you all think about research questions.
Go ahead, Sana.
So, Kajal, I don't know if you've been following Kash for some time, but we did a separate session on how to arrive at a research question. What is a good research question? How do you solve this major minor cardio tension? So, I mean, major minor. It's not, when we say major minor, it's not hierarchy that's in place, really. A minor question could be equally defining to help you talk about the central question, right? So that's why we use the word central, because central kind of defines keep broad landscape cap, but within the central question, then you can have specific questions, and those specific questions are not tangential or minor to the study, so to say. They're not peripheral or tangential, they are central. Basically, they break down that central question in different parts, and which basically then weaves together or helps explain or bring together the whole study, as one whole, right? So don't I would say don't fall in this binary trap of major minor. These are all important questions, just but the central question kind of is a broad indication, but then you have to define your central question also in terms of the field, the timeline, the variables. It is very important that you are able to establish a particular relation in your central question between variables. What variables are we studying, right? X Y Z के बीच में क्या relation are we studying that? What are those X Y Z? Specify that X Y Z. You could always have an intervening variable, which we might discuss in then sub questions in the questions to follow. But is the relationship between variables outlined well enough in your central question? Is it defined well enough in a geographical space, in a time space, basically in a spatio-temporal frame? What the spatio-temporal frame is, as long as your question is signposting the variables, the relationship that you intend to study between the variables, the locale, the spatio-temporal frame, it should be fine, I think. That is, I think, one way to have it specific, at the same time a broader question, and then you can always have sub questions which follow and break down different aspects of that central question for you. I hope that answers, but if Monica has something to add, please do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. Just to kind of make it more a little bit more concrete. So I agree with the fact that so your question, Kajol, because you mentioned that you have this problem that your central question becomes too broad, and then or it's just too narrow, and then you think that a paper would be enough to answer that. Just to say a little bit about broadness and narrowness, I feel like the central question has to be slightly broad, so it does not have to be vague, but it has to be slightly broad. So if your question is slightly broad, I think it is okay. So for instance, one example that I can think of right now is that if we want to study how does political mobilization influence political participation and social change. Now, this could be a broad question. There's some problem with this question because social change is very vague. But let's say, how does political mobilization influence political participation? If this is your broad question, then your narrower question could just be, as Sana said, unpacking these indicators themselves, right? So, for instance, you can your narrower questions could be about what are the ways in which political mobilizations take place, right? And then also kind of linking it to participation. So what are the ways in which participation link to mobilization? So your basically the point is that your sub questions help you answer those broader questions easily, because your sub questions are supposed to be more specific, and they're supposed to kind of pick out individual variable and understand the relationships between the two, right? So in a research of this sort, of course it would differ in different kind of research, but let's say one which is to do with political participation and a bit more relationship linking kind of questions. So it has to be, I think the sub questions just help you unpack the various parts of your central question. It's okay to have slightly broader central question.
Thank you.
Do we have few more hands going on? Okay, then we go to the chat box. Sana and Monica, we have I think close to 7 questions in the chat box. We'll start with I think Sanjana. Sana.
Monica, could you read the question, please, also, so that it's in the recording?
Yeah, so is it this one that what should be the approach if one wants to study the ancient Indian texts from gender and agency point of view, right? Well, what do you mean by what should be the approach? Do you want to, because you already have an approach, you want to study it from gender and agency point of view? So do you
That's the
mean that
approach.
what that's the approach, gender and agency point of view is an approach to study ancient Indian texts? But do you mean theoretical framework? In which case, I mean, it's almost, it could
Sanjana,
be
if you
any
stick with us,
version.
yeah,
Yeah.
Sanjana, if you stick with us, maybe unmute and help explain.
Yeah, Sanjana is here. Sanjana, please.
Meanwhile, we can maybe move to the next question till Sanjana unmutes and has.
I think this is from Vishwajit. What is the expectations in terms of the rigor of the research proposal for applying to the PhD programs?
Monica, do you want to answer this? Rigor, rigor तो चाहिए.
I think the expectation is that you should be broadly familiar with the area in which you are proposing to contribute, right? So, for instance, I give this example all the time. So, one is, of course, that you should be well aware of the primary literature in that area, right? And again, giving this same example. So, for instance, if somebody is working on rape or sexual violence in India, they cannot not know about Pratiksha Bakshi's work, right? So that's a bottom line of how much rigor you need to show, that all the primary work that is in that area, you should be aware of that. I think one thing that to keep in mind is that because not a lot of training is not provided at the level of postgraduate level before PhD, right? So masters, MPhil may there used to be, but now it's scrapped. So at masters and undergrad level, there's not much training on methodology. So even if your methodology section is a bit not that rigorous, I think it's generally okay. A general familiarity with how it could be done, and some idea about, okay, these are the tools that I can use to do it, methods basically, is all right. But on the front of knowing the context and academic literature, I think you need to be well versed with that to be able to present a strong front. Because if you don't do that, then it's not just about the expectation of rigor, right? Because if you don't do it well, the thing is that your proposal might just be very frivolous anyway, because you might be saying that this is a gap, and that gap might not actually be if you're not well versed with the literature. So it's just that.
Monica, I think Sanjana has replied to your question in the chat. She says, yes, ma'am, more in terms of theoretical approach.
I mean, it really depends. You have to kind of read on feminist theory to be able to understand it, what kind of scholarship you want to draw on. But any approach that you want to take from gender and agency point of view would be a feminist approach, right? So some version of feminist theory. It could be liberal feminism. I'm not sure if it still has purchase, but agency is a very liberal concept in that sense. So liberal feminism it could be, but also it could be, it might as well be, I don't know. it could be about recovering or reading agency of marginalized. So it could very well be one of the marginalized approaches coming from a marginalized tradition, subaltern approaches or Dalit feminist approaches, things of that sort, right? It really depends. Like, do you want to just talk about gender in the ancient Indian text, because there's a lot to talk about caste as well. So that also you'll have to justify then, that why do you want to focus on gender and agency only when you're approaching ancient Indian text where caste becomes a central issue. So think about those questions. So I want to say more, but yeah, those are the
I think
those are
those
the
are good questions
questions.
for you to think through with, and perhaps those questions would take you somewhere. Monica's also mentioned some traditions. Maybe look up some scholarship in that tradition, and maybe they'll give you a line in how to do this. Understand applying theory or approaching your proposal from a theoretical standpoint is a concern which is recurring, and hopefully in the future soon we'll do some sessions on just how to basically teach scholars how to handle or deal with theory. So maybe just have look out for that session hopefully.
Next question is from Samira. She has just submitted her master dissertation and is trying to write a PhD one. She has three questions. One, can PhD thesis and dissertation be included in the literature review? Second, how much flexibility is there in terms of modifying the research questions, frameworks, etc., after the proposal being accepted? And the third is, will there ever be a risk of proposal being too narrow, oblique short for a PhD thesis, as opposed to the being too broad or not feasible for 5 years?
I'll just quickly answer the first question. Definitely you can completely cite theses, dissertations in the literature review. There's a way of doing it. Every format, every style has a way to do it, and you can completely cite that's safe. Not a problem. How much flexibility is there? It's completely, I mean, as far as I know, what we started working with is not what we end up working with. So there's a huge, I think that progress is what defines the PhD journey. So you can definitely change your questions, frameworks. It's a very flexible. A research proposal is a tentative thing to begin with, right? So certain things, certain screws, you tie certain ends, certain ties loosen up, which is fine. Many times I've heard students, they have had a proposal on a particular thing, but that completely changes due to issues which you'll have to justify. Why are you changing it in the first place? But as long as that justification is taken by your supervisor, I think you're fine. Um, so yeah, I mean, yeah, that's largely it. uh Monica, I think, has already answered the narrow and the short thing for PhD. um Feasibility as opposed to being too broad or not feasible, again, narrow depends if there's enough literature to help you begin with, if there's enough field that you think you can cover in these 5 years. Narrowness should not be a problem. What really would be a narrow research proposal? It would be something which can really be said not in a PhD thesis but in a paper or a journal article, or maybe a public facing blog. So just ensure that whatever you study is not disposable journalistically, is how I would frame it. But if Monica has thoughts to add.
No, nothing to say on the first two. On the last one, yes. So that's the thing, right? Like, something can probably be said in a journal article, and you might not need a thesis for that. Is the concern that you're having? I feel like the dangers of having a research proposal which is too broad is more than the dangers of having a narrow proposal. The reason being that you can always show a broader appeal of your narrow research area, right? So, for instance, even if I'm working on something very specific about a very small town in Bihar, I can always make broader theoretical claims based on that very small research, right? So there's a way in which you can still give a broader scope to your narrow proposal, but once your proposal is too broad and it seems unwieldy and unfeasible at the outset, there's no rescue to it, right? At least in the mind of the examiners, it would seem like that. So yeah, that's what I would say.
We have two questions from Rachel. One is statistical analysis a more precise way of reaching conclusions than using different qualitative methods? And the second is, what gap is a significant gap?
I'll quickly take the first one. Um, no, there's no hierarchy between qualitative and quantitative here. Please bear that in mind. Whatever is required for a project should be to be justified. those methods should be used. The question of reliability really does not arise unless it's research that you want to evaluate in terms of reliability, replicability, validity, and it has indexes, the question of indexes, parameters, etc., coming in play. But precise way really depends on the topic, really depends on the demands of the project. So if you want to elaborate on this, I'm more than happy to listen to what the project is about. But the question of precision, there's no hierarchy between qualitative and quantitative in social sciences and humanities, as far as I can recall. And I'm also happy to say this. Monica, what gap is a significant gap?
You've given me a question that I don't know an answer to. But I think broadly, I would say that any gap which you can explain as to why it is important to study is a significant gap. So if you're able to explain that, okay, this is the gap and this is why it needs to be studied, would be significant. So in my opinion, there's no insignificant gap, to be honest. It can
Yeah.
be a wrong diagnosis of a gap. That can be the problem. But once you've identified a gap, I would consider it significant prima facie.
I would also add, I would say don't fret over gaps so much. People keep saying gap snape. It's fine. Not every research is going to add to a gap. I mean, even if the previous research is an improvement over if the coming research is an improvement over the previous research, that's also a good gap. I mean, that's also enough to justify why this research is important. So don't fret over so much gaps. Significant. It's not really. I mean, as long as you can justify it, you can say why is this better or this is the improvement, or even if you're building on what has been so far studied, even if you can replicate it, that's completely fine. So yeah, don't fret over this so much.
Yeah, I'll just
Uh,
kind of just reiterate that at the level of proposal, maybe there's some expectation of showing some kind of gap or some kind of necessity of doing this. But when you're doing the research, I would echo what Sana has said, that don't fret over gap so much. And in fact, one of the ways of doing honest research is to just write what you see and what you have understood, right? And without thinking whether this is novel enough or whether this is sensational enough. It's not sensational journalism that we are doing over here, right? So even if it is just reiteration of something that has been said, it is enough, because truth needs to be said again and again for it to remain alive. So even that is fine. Reiteration is fine.
Next question is from Isha Irshad. He's asking, what about the proposal that relies more on fieldwork than the literature, since the area being understudied?
So exploratory research kind of thing, right? So if the area is understudied, more often, like it's probably going to be an exploratory research. In that context also, like, you'll have literature to write in the beginning, and that literature might change a lot because you will find very new kind of data from your field, and you might have a very different kind of literature review after you return from the field. But at the outset also, you'll have to kind of cite literature. So for instance, let's say let's say a part- mm, let's say Bokaro as a township is overstudied, but there might be an understudy of another township. I can't remember any other township right now, but some other township which is understudied. But the idea of township and development exists, right? So if Bokaro is studied, then some theorization has happened on the idea of township, on the idea of development. So those will be the literature that you will be hooking in, right, in your research proposal. So the broader literature around the broader field in which your research will be placed. So just writing literature around that would be your thing to do at the level of proposal, and later on it will probably change.
I think Sana has responded to Sandipan. So what to do when one is looking for a PhD supervisor outside India? Uh, do you want to say anything more? I think that should be.
I just Project Edu Access has been doing a lot of work for applications abroad. So whoever is planning to apply abroad, I think just have a look at the YouTube channel, their website, the resources. There's enough repository of resources that they've built. So have a look at that. We deal more with underserved institutions and institutions in India. Um,
Next is Shalini. What things to keep in mind who just started writing the research proposal or paper? I think I would say read more and more, but let's see what Sana and Monica is saying.
Sana, you go ahead.
I mean, there's no formula. Remember that every research proposal is going to look different. There's no formula that we are planning to replicate here. Read, but don't procrastinate writing. Give yourself 2 to 3 weeks if you have that time to read. If you have a lot of time, then maybe a month or two, but then start writing. Please be open to all possibilities in which a research question can be developed, which is most people start with a question or a research question and then the proposal. That's not a good point to start. Curiosity is the right point to start. So please be open to all possibilities in this world, from questions to arise from. Depending on how or which positions that we come from, there are different interests already that pull us in different directions. So be mindful of those interests and give those interests, those curiosities, a chance to turn into a puzzle for us. And then follow that path and see if this can be developed and how this might be narrowed down into a new research proposal. But please write. Of course, read, but don't delay writing. um, and then try to break down your research in as simple ways as you can. Try to explain it to a friend and see if you can simplify it for yourself. Kya sawal hai, which is bothering us, right? So it starts from that um, restlessness, but how do you translate that restlessness towards a particular topic or an issue into a doable, feasible research project? Take help when needed, but there's no right or wrong way to do this. um, and there's no formula to replicate it. You will know when you've arrived at the question, but please be open to different possibilities arising from curiosity. um, yeah, I think that. Monica, do you have anything to add? Any actionable points to add?
Okay, then we have two more questions. One is from Afreen and one is Gajendra. I think same kind of questions. How to choose appropriate theoretical framework for the research proposal topic. And the second, how to get articles, books from authentic and reputed journals in case we do not have subscription to those ones. And even Gajendra's question follows the same line. When you go for literature review, that time so many eminent database and journal is subscription based. What is the other option to access these resources? Is there any other open access resources like Google Scholar?
I will quickly answer the issue related to database. So Kashmir has done a session on open scholarship, where we kind of tell students how to find literature. I understand lots of research work is behind paywalls, which is very unfortunate, and of course very consumerist. But there are also sites, databases, etc., which provide things for free. And we have done a session on that. I have already signposted it in YouTube. I'm going to drop the link again here so you can have a look at this. This should answer both these questions. You can there's Facebook pages, I think, ask for PDFs, where you can ask for particular PDFs, books, research papers, and students who are based at different institutions across country, if they have access to it, they provide you with it. So that's an informal network out there. There are also other informal archives. Anna's archive is one. um, to look at, and of course we've discussed more or formal networks too in this session, so maybe just have a look at this session. Monica, do you want to answer the other bits of it?
I mean, the other bit is only about like theoretical framework. How do you choose theoretical framework for your research proposal topic? I mean, based on the answers that we have given so far, no. So there are certain central concepts that you identify in your research, and then think of what traditions, theoretical traditions, do these concepts come from. So, for instance, if the question is about labor and agency, labor and undermining of agency, let's say, then Marxist tradition becomes a place to go to. Similarly, if the question is about gender, if the question is about Brahmanical patriarchy, so the role of caste in gender, then it should be particular tradition, like Dalit feminist or whatever you think about. So it really depends, like what are the concepts you're dealing with and the research questions that you want to answer, and what you seek to say as a response to those, like what kinds of areas you want to delve in. So it really depends on that. There's no answer, there's no formula to how to pick theoretical framework for your. So if you tell a little bit maybe more about your research, we'll be able to give more detailed answer. But also we are running badly out of time, so perhaps in a different session. And also about the free resources, Sana has dropped the link, and we have discussed that in detail over there. Just quickly, there's Anna's archive, LibGen. There's one called PDF. What is it called? Ask for PDF on Facebook, which is very active. So if you need some book, they can make it available on the website. So these are some, and Sci-Hub, of course, for articles, journal articles. Somebody was asking, so you can use Sci-Hub website. I'll drop a link of that over here. Yeah.
I think we do not have any questions. So with that question and answer. Okay, one more message. Who is that? Okay, it is
Unless
Emily.
any concerns, yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much, our speaker, Sana and Monica, and to our audience, the participants. Uh, I think before you leave, please feel free to give us your feedback in terms of if, how did you like this session, and also how do you want us to improve our session, and if you want that we should pick up any topic or anything which is of interest to you, please write to us. We will definitely follow it. Right? And before we say goodbye to each other, please, I'll also announce about our next session, which is on navigating the National Archives of India, understanding the basic for accessing the archives. And the session will be, our speaker is Syed Farid Ahmed. He's former Deputy Director of National Archives in India. Right? So looking forward for that session. With this, we are coming to an end. Thank you so much to everyone. But please give us the feedback. And thank you so much to everyone, speaker and the
Um,
Thank you.
participants.
feedback will be sent soon after, so please take your time to
We
fill
will
it.
send the link. I have already shared it in the chat box. Bye bye.
Bye.